Hi there. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for joining me. Let's talk about Donald Trump's indictment, the 34 counts that the Manhattan DA is pursuing against former US President Donald Trump. So please hit that like button. Please cast your vote in our poll. What do you think the outcome of the indictment will be? Do you think the case will be dismissed? Do you think there will be a plea deal? Do you think the jury will convict? Or the jury may be undecided if it goes to trial? We'll have to see. Much to do before we get to trial, though. I'm going to talk about the possible defenses. I'll talk about the penalties. We'll take a look. So hi there. Thank you for joining me. We'll take a look at the indictment, which is 17 pages, and the 34 counts. So I'll talk to you about that. And we'll also look at the statement of facts, which is what the DA put together as evidence, but not all of it, as they indicate in the statement of facts. But they lay out some of the evidence that they're going to be presenting and also to support the charges in the indictment. So, hi there, I'm Michele Hagan. I'm a legal analyst and I'm a former prosecutor. You may recognize me because I've covered a lot of different cases, including the Elizabeth Holmes and the Gabby Petito, the Petito versus Laundrie case, etc. So welcome to my channel, Michele's Analysis. Please hit that like button. Please say hello. Thank you for joining me. And if you want to give a super chat and contribute to me making these videos, I'll put a PayPal link in the chat box and also in the description box below the video. So this video is for education and information purposes, simply my analysis, simply my opinion. So what's your analysis? So let's go through the 34 counts. So is it hush money to silence Stormy Daniels before the 2016 presidential election? Or was it proper payment for legal services? So the prosecution is alleging that there was a catch and kill scheme. In other words, that any negative information was being intercepted by a publisher, AMI Publishing, or publisher, and they were squashing those stories or buying those stories so that they wouldn't come out, so it wouldn't affect the 2016 presidential campaign. However, that's not in the indictment. It may be relevant evidence to support a scheme of falsifying business records, which is what Donald Trump is being charged with. 34 counts, 34 felonies, alleging that he falsified business records. What business records? Well, the prosecution is alleging that the Trump organization, which maintains and keeps these records of the payments that were made to Michael Cohen, who was the attorney for Donald Trump. Michael Cohen is the one who paid Stormy Daniels $130,000 hush money so she would keep silent before the 2016 presidential election. That's what the prosecution is alleging. They're alleging that Cohen did it on behalf of Trump. And it was reported, it was falsely reported, and the records maintained and kept by the Trump Organization, which is the real estate firm owned by Donald Trump. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the grand jury indictment. Now, this is a grand jury indictment in Manhattan charging Donald Trump with 34 counts of falsifying business records. So, in other words, writing out a check to pay Michael Cohen, but tagging it or reporting it as a legal expense. So, disguising it as a legal expense, this hush money. That's what the prosecution is alleging. So, it's penal code section or penal law in New York. It's section 175.10, which is exactly what I expected. If you look at the comment page, and our community page, on the community page, you will see how I said that the most likely charge is going to be exactly this one, 175.10, which says The defendant in the county of New York and elsewhere on or about February 14th, 2017. This is 2023, so I wonder if there's any statute of limitations defenses here. Is it a 5-year statute of limitation or a 6-year on these felonies? Because that's the time in which charges have to be filed, or otherwise cases can get dismissed if they're not timely filed. So, on or about February 14, 2017, with the intent to defraud and intent to commit another crime and aid and conceal the commission thereof, made and caused a false entry in the business records of an enterprise, to wit, an invoice from Michael Cohen, marked as a record of the Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust and kept and maintained by the Trump Organization. So that's count one. They're all very similar. It's the same charge. This one relates to, it was marked as a record of the Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust. Now, question is that a business record of the Trump Organization? The prosecution's probably going to argue, yes, it is, because he put all of his assets in a revocable trust when he became the president. The payments were made after he was elected, the payments to Cohen, but the payment to Stormy Daniel was made just prior to the election. So please say hello, hit that thumbs up. Let me know you guys are there and you can hear me. Put your questions in the chat box if you have any. And please do subscribe to this channel so you can participate in our chat box. And do cast your vote in our poll. Do you think the case will be dismissed? Well, it looks like so far you guys are voting the case will be dismissed. Well, okay, so interesting question. If they're saying the records, it was reported as a record of the Donald J. Revocable Trust, is that a business record? Interesting. Count two is that there was a false entry made in the business records of the Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust, a false ledger entry. And these records are kept and maintained by the Trump Organization. Again, this is dealing with Donald Trump's revocable trust. Now, is that a business enterprise? Interesting question. Now, counts 1 through 8 relate to the Donald J. Trust Revocable Trust. So we will see Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust. So we will see if the defense argues that point. I don't know if it's valid or not. It's just the thought I had. Okay, so let me read just another one of these. Third count. The defendant on February 14th did a false entry in the business records in the general ledger of the Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust. Count 4, false entry in the business records of the revocable trust account check. Now, these are related to checks. There were 11 checks that were paid to Michael Cohen, $35,000 each check over an 11-month period. So each month, Michael Cohen would submit an invoice to the Trump Organization. The Trump controller, not Donald Trump, the Trump controller would tell the accounts payable to post it as a legal expense and to make payment, send the check to Michael Cohen. Trump, question is, was Trump involved in that? It went from the controller to the accounts payable supervisor. I don't see anything in the statement of facts that indicated Trump was involved at that point. Okay. Count 5 is relating to, and this is where it switches. Actually, let me get to count. They're redundant. A lot of these are the same counts. Count 8. This is now where these counts relate to Donald Trump personally. So it says the defendant on or about April 13th, with the intent to defraud and intent to commit another crime, which would be what? To disguise a campaign violation, to violate campaign laws, and aid and conceal the commission that made and caused a false entry in the business records, to wit, an invoice from Michael Cohen marked as a record of Donald J. Trump, which was kept and maintained by the Trump Organization. Again, I have a question here. These are the records of Donald J. Trump personally, and the checks. Out of these 11 checks, 9 were personally signed by Donald Trump from his personal bank account. So is that considered a business record of the Trump Organization? The prosecution alleges that those checks, those invoices, were scanned into the records of the Trump Organization. Therefore, it's a business record. We'll have to see what the defense does with that. So it's all about in being invoiced by Michael Cohen, making a false entry into the business records, the checks being labeled as legal services when prosecution is alleging that's basically a cover-up for the hush money to Stormy Daniels. So 34 counts. Let me look at my notes here. And that is based on 11 invoices that Michael Cohen sent to the Trump Organization. I don't see that it was sent to Donald Trump, but I don't know. We'll have to see. And again, the statement of facts that I have here, which are about 13 pages of the evidence that the prosecution is putting the Trump on notice as to why this evidence supports the indictment. So 11 invoices for Michael Cohen, 11 checks. 9 of the checks were personally written on Donald Trump's account, signed by Donald Trump, stapled to the invoice, and then mailed back to Cohen. I don't know. It looks like that went through accounts payable. I don't know if Donald Trump actually mailed and sent it to Cohen. I don't know. Or maybe just signed the checks. Maybe he saw that it was indicated as legal services, because the defense is going to argue this was a retainer, although there's no retainer agreement, according to the prosecution. These were retainer payments for legal services. This was not hush money to Stormy Daniels. That'll be a question, a factual question for the jury to determine. Okay, so any questions? Anybody questions out there? All right. So 2 of the checks, 2 of the 11 checks. Now, each one of these 11 checks was for $35,000 to pay Michael Cohen. It was entered and identified as payment for legal services. Prosecution is saying no. It's a disguise for hush money to Stormy Daniels, and therefore Donald Trump is guilty of falsifying business records. 34 counts, each one is a felony. If he's convicted on any one of these, it's up to 4 years in prison. The judge could sentence Donald Trump on any one of these. If he's convicted on any count, 4 years in prison. Well, what if he gets convicted on all counts? Could the judge run it 4 years consecutively on each one? That's up to the judge, but not likely. But a judge could sentence Donald Trump to the maximum, which is 4 years. There is no minimum on this, so he could get probation. So we'll have to see what happens. Again, it's up to the judge. Why isn't this thrown out because of statute of limitations? Good question, CH. Well, I don't know if the statute of limitations is 5 or 6 years on a felony in New York. I'm a California lawyer, but I did my research. It looks like it's either 5 or 6 years. So if these checks were sent in 2017, that would be 2022. So it looks like it's probably 6-year statute of limitations, the time in which they have to file this file these charges against Donald Trump. So 2017 plus 6 would be 2023. But they're alleging some of these dates start in February 2017 through to December of 2017. So the other question I have is whether or not the statute of limitations would be extended up to when they discovered this. So in other words, when they audited the business records, or when the Trump Organization filed the tax returns, or that prior prosecution against the Trump Organization and the CFO, Alan Weisselberg, who that case was before the very same judge on this case who oversaw the grand jury indictment of Trump, and looks like who's going to be the trial judge in this Trump prosecution. That same judge sentenced the CFO, Weisselberg, to 5 months in jail, and it was based on a plea deal with the prosecution, and also imposed $1.6 million fine against the Trump Organization, which is the max the judge could impose. And there was no jail time for anybody in the Trump Organization, and Trump wasn't convicted or charged in that case. And also Michael Cohen, he took a plea deal too to go to prison. And then he did testify in the grand jury. And the thing with the grand jury is they're the ones who recommended these charges. They heard testimony that was presented by the prosecution. The defense doesn't put on testimony in a grand jury indictment. And there's a saying, I was a prosecutor for many years, that a grand jury could indict a ham sandwich. So, based on the witnesses, which were Michael Cohen, I think David Pecker from AMI, I think Stormy Daniels testified. There were several witnesses and a lot of evidence that the prosecution presented to the grand jury. Grand jury was allowed to ask questions, and they determined that these 34 counts should be pursued against Donald Trump for falsifying business records. Okay, so it was the grand jury who determined what the charges are. And it's in New York, there are 23 people that sit in the grand jury, and 12 of the 16 have to vote to indict, at least 12 of the 16. Okay, so any other questions? And by the way, CH, the statute of limitations will probably be brought up as one of the pretrial motions. Now, the next court date, is going to be December 4th. And at that time, I'm sure there'll be motions to dismiss this case. Could be for statute of limitations, could be for some deficiencies in the indictment. Is there enough information in there to put a defendant on notice of what they're being charged with? And let me give you an example here. So in the statement of facts that Donald Trump was given by the DA to basically lay out some of the facts to support their indictment, there's a couple things that I have questions about, okay? So what happens if all the jury is biased against Trump? Well, you're going to ask questions in voir dire. Each side, both the prosecution and the defense attorneys, will have the opportunity to ask questions of each of these jurors before they're selected to determine if they have any bias against Trump. Now, of course, Trump is arguing it's a political persecution. There's no case here. He did nothing wrong. And speaking of that, let me show you a couple things, highlight some things in the statement of facts that the prosecution has laid out to support their indictment, which I have questions about, because these statements don't indicate that Trump was involved. Okay, so listen to this. So I'm looking at a couple paragraphs here. It's paragraph 20. The defendant there, this is what the prosecution is alleging. The defendant, Donald Trump, didn't want to make the $130,000 payment himself, and he asked lawyer A, which I believe is Michael Cohen, and the Trump Organization CFO, that's Alan Weisselberg, to find a way to make a payment. After discussing various payment options, Cohen agreed he would make the payment. Cohen agreed to make the payment. So Cohen made the payment based on a home equity line of credit that he got against his house for $131,000. He set up a bank account under the name of, I think it's Essential Consultants, LLC, to have that money deposited, to then take that money and have that money transferred to Stormy Daniels as the payment for the $130,000. So in paragraph 24, this is where the prosecution says Trump falsified business records. It says in or around January 2017, the Trump Organization CFO and Cohen, lawyer A, met to discuss how lawyer A, which would be Cohen, would be reimbursed for the money he paid to ensure woman 2, which I believe is Stormy Daniels' silence. The CFO and Cohen asked Cohen to bring a copy of the bank statement showing that the $130,000 payment was made. Paragraph 25. The CFO and lawyer A agreed to a total repayment of $420,000 to Cohen. There's nothing in here about Trump was the one that was agreeing to this payment of $420,000. I think Cohen says later on that, yes, he had that discussion. And again, this case is going to boil down to the credibility issues. Who do they believe? Do they believe Trump? You know, he says there's no case, assuming if he takes the stand. We'll have to talk about that later. But the main witnesses here are Cohen, Michael Cohen, the attorney, who's already pled guilty to lying, right, to falsify, to violating the law by an illegal campaign contribution, this $130,000 to Stormy Daniels, right? David Pecker from AMI, who the prosecution is alleging would catch and kill some negative stories against Trump prior to the 2016 election. He also took a deal. So, you know, the question is, who is the jury going to believe, right? But they're laying out, the prosecution is laying out the statement of facts. They're talking about a conversation took place between the CFO and lawyer A, which I believe is Michael Cohen. It doesn't say anything about Trump being involved in that, discussing how much the $420,000 that Cohen was going to be paid, how they were going to pay Stormy Daniels. And then they computed the $420,000 to Cohen. Get this, because the CFO decided to double the amount of what Cohen was asking for. He was asking to be repaid the $130,000 and the $50,000 in legal expenses, which I don't know what that was for, but that's $180,000. You double that, that's $360,000. And the reason the CFO doubled it, and again, in the statement of facts, it doesn't say anything about Donald Trump being involved in that conversation. But again, I'm just looking at possible defenses here. So the $360,000, the reason it was doubled is because the CFO decided after you take out taxes and stuff, the net amount would be $180,000, which would be the actual cost or the actual expenses to Michael Cohen. But then the CFO decided to add a $60,000 bonus to Michael Cohen, and that's how they came up with the $420,000 that Michael Cohen got in those 12 separate payments of $35,000 for each month. Okay, so that's the 11 checks that Michael Cohen got, 2 that were signed by the CFO and Donald J. Trump Jr. as trustees of Donald Trump's revocable trust, and then the 9 other payments for $35,000 to Michael Cohen were signed on Donald J. Trump's bank account, his personal bank account. Okay, so again, this is a case about falsifying business records. So what the prosecution is saying is that Donald Trump is guilty of falsifying business records because the ledger entries in the accounting records for Trump Organization indicated it was payment for legal services. When the prosecution is saying, no, that's a disguise. It was actually payment for hush money to silence Stormy Daniels so it wouldn't interfere with the 2016 presidential campaign. The prosecution is saying each one of those checks also is falsifying business records because it wasn't payment for legal services. There was no retainer agreement between Michael Cohen and Donald Trump. So, interesting questions. Okay, then there's also paragraph 28 here of the statement of facts. On or about February 14th, lawyer A, Michael Cohen, emailed to the controller of the Trump Organization his first monthly invoice. It wasn't emailed to Donald Trump. It was emailed to the controller, who then indicated to the accounts payable and said, post this to legal expenses. The accounts payable supervisor electronically entered it into their accounting system, posted it as a legal expense, not as hush money, as a legal expense, and then a check was sent to Michael Cohen, that $35,000 a month for, I think it's 11 months or 12 months, whatever it is, to come up with $420,000 payment to Michael Cohen. All right, let me look at the questions here. Isn't there a higher court that can stop this case? No, it first has to go, good question, but it first has to go to, okay, let me explain quickly here the New York state court system. This is not a federal case. This is not a U.S. district court case. This doesn't involve U.S. attorneys. This is dealing with a local district attorney suing a former U.S. president for falsifying business records because of hush money or because of, disguising the money as illegal services, writing it off on their taxes, etc. Although the U.S. attorney never pursued any tax crimes against Donald Trump. They pursued it against, or actually they didn't pursue it against Donald Trump. Neither did the predecessor DA. The prior DA from Manhattan also didn't pursue this case against Donald Trump, but this new DA who came in January, who was elected in January 2022, decided to put this in front of a grand jury, let the grand jury decide, and the grand jury came back and indicted. So they're pursuing these 34 counts against Donald Trump. Okay, so in New York, there is the criminal court, okay, for the district attorney. It's the county of, it's Manhattan, New York, right? There's the criminal court, which deals with misdemeanors. These are not misdemeanors. These are all felonies. So that means it gets bumped up to what's called the Supreme Court of New York, okay? They handle the felony cases. Above the Supreme Court is the Court of Appeals in New York, okay? They are above. They're the highest. If you appeal to that, the next appeal would be the U.S. Supreme Court. So in California, we have Superior Court, we have the Court of Appeal, and we have the Supreme Court. But in New York, Supreme Court of California. In New York, it's criminal court, it's the Supreme Court of New York, and then it's the Court of Appeals of New York, you see? So first it has to be, the next court appearance is December 4th. I'm sure the defense will be filing their motions to dismiss. It's insufficient evidence. There's insufficient, it's inadequate indictment. It doesn't have enough evidence to show that Donald Trump actually participated or had knowledge of these falsifying business records, these ledger entries, or what the account payable supervisor was doing, or that the controller indicated these payments were to be for legal expenses. So we'll have to see, okay? So there'll be motions made. Then depending on what the outcome of that, assuming they lose and are unable to dismiss this case, then it proceeds to trial. And that's a jury trial. So in order for Donald Trump to be convicted on any one of these counts, it has to be a unanimous decision to convict. So that means all 12 jurors have to decide to convict Donald Trump of one or all of these counts. They have to come to a unanimous verdict. If 11 jurors decide to convict and one juror decides not to convict or is undecided, then that is what's called a hung jury, okay? And it's not a conviction because one juror or one or more jurors has decided not to convict. Likewise, a jury could decide, all 12 could decide not guilty. And if Donald Trump is found not guilty on these charges, that's it. He cannot be retried on these charges. But if a jury comes back split, 6-6, 5-7, 5-7, 7-5, blah, blah, you know what I'm talking about. If they're not able to come up with all 12 to convict, then the case can be retried. Okay. But this case is going to be fought. Donald Trump's a fighter. And if you saw his press conference that he just did at Mar-a-Lago, he's shifting the blame to everyone else. He's blaming the DA. He's blaming the judge. They're out to get him, basically, is what he's saying. He's talking about what Hillary Clinton did. He's talking about the Hunter Biden laptop. He's talking about Joe Biden, has classified documents and hasn't turned them over. He's stating, it was like a campaign speech. And again, this is not a political video. I'm not here to take sides. I'm just legally analyzing what the law says and what this indictment says and what the possible defenses and penalties are. Okay. How you vote, that's up to you. Okay. But in that speech that Donald Trump just gave tonight, is part campaign speech. He's still campaigning for president. And he's also putting out there his defense. He said there's no case against him. He said he did nothing wrong. He said the DA's out to get him. The DA campaigned to get elected by saying he was going to prosecute Trump. All of that, whether or not it's true or not, that's what Donald Trump is saying. Okay. He's going to fight this. And this case is going to be, those motions will tell us a lot about whether or not he's able to get one or more of these counts kicked out. Okay. So let me see your questions. What is your analysis of the outcome? Well, it's a paper case, right? So they're going to have to present all the ledgers showing that how things were identified as legal services, payment for legal expenses. And it's going to rest on the credibility of Michael Cohen, who's already been, convicted, who's already pled in, campaign violations. And David Pecker, who also took a plea deal. If those are their witnesses, that's going to be a big area for cross-examination. Now they want to blame Donald Trump for this. So the question is, what evidence do they have that Donald Trump was actually involved and knew about how these payments were made, knew that it was entered as payment for legal expenses? The accounts payable supervisor is the one who inputted that information. The Trump Organization controller is the one who determined to have it be paid as a legal expense. Was Donald Trump involved in that? Okay, I'm sure the prosecution is going to say, oh, come on. He definitely had these conversations. He knew about this bad press. He knew that Stormy Daniels was about to come out and talk about what happened, especially after that Access Hollywood video. He knew what was going on here, and he just let other people deal with it. But the thing is you have to show that Donald Trump, the defendant, had the intent to defraud, that he had the intent to conceal. Okay? And those two checks, the initial two checks, were signed by Donald Trump Jr. and by the CFO, Alan Weisselberger. They weren't signed by Donald Trump, and they were from the Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust. So whether or not that's considered a business record. Then the other 9 checks were signed by Donald Trump. These checks that were sent to Michael Cohen for the $35,000 in each check, which the prosecution is alleging was repayment for the $130,000 hush money that was paid to Stormy Daniels. And again, like every defendant, Donald Trump is presumed innocent until he's found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So is it reasonable to believe that Donald Trump didn't know how this was being entered as, how it was being documented as a legal expense or not? Okay. So let me see what other questions. Please put your questions. This case will not be dismissed. Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it'll be dismissed. I don't even know if it'll even get dismissed. If, how quickly this case will work, I don't know, but it happens to coincidentally, take place during the presidential campaign in the lead up to the 2024 election. And so there was discussion today in the arraignment about when the trial date might be. Okay. The prosecution wants the trial to start in January of 2024. Okay. The defense is saying, what about spring of 2024? So that's right up against the next presidential election. So there certainly is evidence here that a jury could, first of all, the grand jury, You know, if you think about them, they're 23 citizens, okay, who usually, I think in New York, it's a 1 month grand jury service. They're the ones who heard the witnesses. They're the ones who, you know, requested documents, asked questions. They're the ones that gave Donald Trump the opportunity to come in and testify. And of course, he wasn't going to testify because, you know, Fifth Amendment, he doesn't want any testimony being used against him. So the grand jury, you know, could be citizens that just come in and make their civic duty, hear the evidence, and they decide. And at a grand jury, like I said earlier, you know, the joke when I was a DA was, you know, grand juries can indict a ham sandwich. Okay. But that's no shame or shade to grand jurors. They do an incredible service, civic duty, and service to the public here. So I'm sure they thoroughly listened to all the evidence, and this was their determination. But the issue is whether or not the trial jury is going to come to the same conclusion if they're going to convict Donald Trump based on this evidence. And I think there are holes. There's definitely areas, critical areas, where it doesn't look like Donald Trump was involved. And there's also a big question about the credibility of the most important witnesses to show that they had conversations with Trump about the hush money or the payment to Stormy Daniels. And that witness is Michael Cohen. And he's already pled to campaign violations. He's already admitted that he paid the $130,000 to Stormy Daniels, you know, so it's a good question for a jury. All right, can some of the 34 cases counts be dismissed before trial? Yes, definitely. And that'll be part of the motions to get some of these counts kicked out. Saying there's insufficient evidence in the indictment, or there's a defect or deficiency in the indictment. It's a possibility, but you know, a lot of times judges err in caution and let the jury decide. Let the jury be the ones to decide whether or not to kick it out. All right. Trump is on tape. Yeah, well, but is he the one that, because he's particularly specifically charged with entering into the ledger the false statement, you know, claiming it's a legal expense. It looks like, according to the statement of facts, it was one of the employees of the Trump organization, the accounts payable supervisor, who electronically entered those ledger into the accounting ledger, labeled it as payment for legal services, legal expenses. Okay, so that's going to be a question. All right, his sig is on the check, so yeah, his signatures are on the checks, but does that show? And you know, this is a high standard here. Does it show that Donald Trump had the intent, I'm reading from the indictment, had the intent to defraud and the intent to commit another crime? What's the other crime? Violating election law, or violating, campaign laws by disguising a campaign contribution that Michael Cohen pled to as hush money. So it's intent to defraud and intent to commit another crime and aid and conceal the commission of it. The aiding and concealing the commission of it could be a question mark, because those discussions in the statement of facts relating to the conversations between Michael Cohen and the CFO, Weisselberg, doesn't indicate that Donald Trump was involved in those discussions, okay, in some of those discussions. But it's aid and conceal the commission. How did Donald Trump aid and conceal? Well, maybe he had conversations with, according to Michael Cohen, Trump basically was fully aware of all this, that they were paying off Stormy Daniels for her silence. But was Trump involved in the ledger entries, having the checks identified as legal expenses? You know, along those lines. I don't know, because it's premature. I don't know what the defense is going to argue, but they have things to work with. They definitely do. Okay, so let me see here what else I wanted to talk to you about. I have plenty of notes here. Hang on. Okay, so it's down to those 11 checks and whether or not things were entered properly in the accounting ledgers. That would be the falsification of business records. If they put something in there that wasn't true, they could get convicted. He could get convicted of falsifying business records. Donald Trump's, of course, going to say, I didn't do that. Somebody in the Trump organization did it. Wasn't me. All right. So again, the time period of this, and this is important for possibly a statute of limitations, which is the time in which you have to bring charges. Otherwise, charges can get dismissed. So the statute of limitations defense, which the defense may bring up here, because this involves payments that were made from February of 2017 to December of 2017. Stormy Daniels was paid by Michael Cohen in 2016, just before the November 2016 presidential election. Okay. But the payments that were made by Trump's revocable trust or by Trump's personal account were made in 2017. So my question is, what's the statute of limitations? What's the time period in which they have to bring charges? Is it 5 years or 6 years? So we're going to see what the defense argues there. Okay, so, and again, counts 1 through 7 deal with Donald Trump, J. Trump's revocable trust. Now, is that considered a business entity? And what the prosecution is saying, whether or not these checks were made from Donald J. Trump's revocable trust or from Donald J. Trump's personal accounts, they were business records because they were records maintained by the Trump organization. Now, I think there could be arguments made there that they were just personal records for maybe convenience. He kept them with the Trump organization. I don't know. I don't know if it's going to work or not. We'll have to see. So any other questions, hit that like button. And if you want to contribute to me making these videos, I put a PayPal link. If you want to super chat me, I put a PayPal link in the chat box and in the description box below the video. And do vote in our poll. How are we doing in our poll? 75% of you think the case is going to be dismissed. Let's see. Yeah. So, we'll get a better idea. But I think this case is kind of a mess in a way because of the timing of when these charges were brought. Because, of course, the defense is going to argue this is a political prosecution. Look at when they filed the charges. The timing of all this is suspect. They're going to point the finger at the motive behind the DA. They're going to make them look like evil figures who basically trumped up all these charges against Donald Trump. Trump's the victim. They all had a political agenda to get him. They'll turn it into a political case. Okay? The defense is going to say that it's a political persecution. And they're going to say Cohen and all these other witnesses have a motive to lie because they got caught for their wrongdoings and they took plea deals. So now Trump has to pay the price. I could just hear what the defense is going to say. But this judge, he sat on the prior case. He sat on the Steve Bannon case. He was the judge that oversaw that. He also oversaw the grand jury proceedings in this case against Trump. He also was the trial judge in the case against the Trump organization and the CFO for falsifying business records, right? And the CFO took a plea deal from the prosecution for 5 months, and Trump organization paid $1.6 million fine. Donald Trump was not charged, nor was he convicted in that case. This case now, 34 counts for falsifying business records, is against Donald Trump alone as the defendant. Okay? So it's going to boil down to the credibility. Is the jury going to believe these, Michael Cohen or David Pecker or whoever else they bring forward to say that Donald Trump, how are they going to show that he had the intent to defraud? Yes, big picture, you could say, of course, Donald Trump paid off Stormy Daniels. I mean, they could argue that. And he used Michael Cohen, the fixer, to take care of this. And he just funneled it through his business organization, the Trump organization, put it in his business, as part of their accounting, labeled it as legal expenses. Therefore, he could write it off, or the organization the company could write it off as a tax expense. All right, you see that? But the issue is the U.S. attorney didn't go after Donald Trump for any issue around his. They're not pursuing at this point issues around his tax return, false tax returns that I'm aware of. So, any other questions? And the prior DA to this current Manhattan DA didn't pursue charges against Donald Trump. Okay, so no one is above the law, and if the prosecution is able to prove these 34 counts in the indictment, Donald Trump is facing significant prison time. Just on one count, he could be sentenced to up to 4 years in prison. There's no minimum on these counts, so he could get probation. But even though Donald Trump has no prior criminal history, a judge could, I'm not saying this judge would, but a judge could put the former president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, into prison if he's convicted on even one of these counts. Okay? So these counts of falsifying business records are no joke. All right? So any other questions? Questions for anybody else? Let's see. The defense is going to have to look at, I'm sure the defense has already been looking at this indictment and going, hey, there's holes here. Trump, it doesn't look like the prosecution alleging that Trump was involved in the discussion about the $420,000 payment, because that was negotiated between the CFO and Cohen, according to what's in the statement of facts that was put together by the prosecution. Now, in the last footnote of this statement of facts provided by the prosecution to Donald Trump to put him on notice of the possible evidence that they're going to be presenting, in that last page, in the last footnote, the DA does say, let me read it to you so I get it right here. I'm reading from the statement of facts that the statement of facts contains certain of the information that is relevant to the events described herein, and does not contain all the facts relevant to the charged conduct. So they're not putting all their cards on the table. The DA is not putting, it's not an exhaustive list of what's in this statement of facts, of the information or the evidence that the DA will present. So they have not put all their cards on the table. So now it's the job of the defense to poke holes in this indictment to show that there isn't evidence or information alleged in this indictment to support a count, to say count 1 or count 34, any one of these counts. They didn't plead sufficient information in this indictment to support a finding that Donald Trump had the intent to defraud or intent to commit another crime and aid in concealing the commission of those crimes. Maybe they're going to say the indictment, this indictment is insufficient. Or maybe they're going to say that there's just not enough evidence to support any of these charges. All right, let me see what else. Do you guys have any questions? Ask your questions. Hit that like button. Again, there are some holes. There's definitely some holes in the statement of facts. There are some areas where Trump was not involved, because they're saying, the DA is saying that the controller is the one that said, post it as a legal expense to the account supervisor. The accounts payable supervisor electronically entered it into the ledger as a legal expense payment. Those $35,000 checks that were made to Michael Cohen were labeled as a legal expense for legal services, which the prosecution is arguing that's falsifying business records. Therefore, Donald Trump is guilty. Okay. So let me see what else I have. Do you guys have any other questions? It's been a heck of a week already. So let me talk about the next steps here. All right. So what's going to happen now is the prosecution is going to present what's called discovery to the defense. So discovery is all the evidence, the statements, the witness testimony, whatever they have to show that can be used against Donald Trump that they're going to present in trial. Okay, and that's called discovery. So it's evidence that could incriminate Donald Trump, as well as evidence that could exculpate or find Donald Trump innocent. Okay, they have to turn over stuff that's helpful and harmful to Donald Trump. They have to turn that over to the defense. That's called discovery. Now, these are grand jury, these were testimony, witness statements made to a grand jury, because these witnesses, like Michael Cohen, testified in front of the grand jury. So they would be turning over the witness testimony. I'm sure some of it's going to be redacted to the defense as giving them, here's some of the witness statements. These are some of the testimony that the witnesses made at the grand jury. Okay. The next thing that'll happen is there'll be motions made by the defense and possibly by the prosecution, but at this point by the defense, to dismiss one or more of these charges, to get this indictment thrown out, to say that there's insufficient evidence to support each one of these, or insufficient information in the indictment to support each one of these counts, to show that Donald Trump participated in this, showing they had the intent to defraud, etc. Okay, so basically saying the indictment's inadequate or defective, and it's not giving proper notice to Donald Trump, therefore the account should be thrown out. Okay, one or more of these counts. They could ask for the indictment to be dismissed on the basis of the interests of justice, because this is just basically, maybe the defense will argue, it's basically intentional interference with the presidential election. Maybe that's what they're going to argue. I don't know. Maybe they're going to say that selective prosecution, they're coming after Trump because he's running for president. It's a political maneuver. I don't know. We'll have to see. The timing of its suspect, maybe that's what they're going to argue. But the DA has already said, look, I bring cases when they're ready. I prosecute cases when they're ready. And the grand jury did a thorough investigation. And this indictment is their indictment, indicting Donald Trump on 34 counts of falsifying business records. Okay, there could be other motions to suppress evidence. You know, if some of the evidence was obtained illegally. I don't know about that audio, the tape recording of Trump. I don't know if that'll be subject to a motion to suppress the evidence, because maybe you're not allowed to tape people without their knowledge. I don't know. We'll find out. I don't know what the law is in New York. In California, if it did that, it would get thrown out. Okay. There'll be plenty of pretrial motions called motions in limine. And those are motions to keep out evidence or to admit evidence in the trial. So those are motions that either side can make to have certain evidence allowed in trial or kept out in trial. So like in the Elizabeth Holmes case, they made motions to keep out all the evidence regarding her lifestyle, that kind of stuff, because they argued it was too prejudicial towards her. In this case, you know, all the stuff about, and I wanted to bring that up. In the statement of facts here, these are all alleged facts, right? And the indictment is allegations. It doesn't mean that Donald Trump committed these offenses, these charges. They're alleging. And just because someone alleges, the DA alleges, or the grand jury alleges these counts against Donald Trump, doesn't mean they're true, because like every defendant, they are presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay? So in the statement of facts, the prosecution sets out a catch and kill scheme, which is basically what the AMI was doing to capture negative stories against Donald Trump and suppress, you know, either by Karen McDougal's silence or Stormy Daniels' silence, or suppress stories that were negative against Donald Trump. Okay. Now, whether or not any of that information, any of that evidence comes into trial will be interesting, because Donald Trump is not being charged with a catch and kill scheme to suppress negative information. He's being charged with falsifying business records. The DA may argue, no, this is just part of the larger scheme here, part of the hush money, painting the picture of the hush money, silencing Karen McDougal, paying off Stormy Daniels. You know, that was all just part of the catch and kill scheme. I imagine the defense is going to ask that all that suppressing negative information stories be kept out. Okay. They also talk about the story regarding suppressing the story about the doorman at Trump Tower, who apparently says that alleges that Donald Trump fathered a child out of wedlock. And allegedly the doorman was supposed to be paid a certain amount of money for his silence. I'm sure that's going to be kept out. I'm sure there's going to be a motion for that to be kept out of trial. There's also suppressing Woman One's account. Woman One, I believe, is Karen McDougal. I could be wrong. Who had a relationship with Donald Trump, and she was paid $150,000 for her silence, allegedly. Whether or not AMI ultimately paid her $150,000 to buy her story regarding the alleged affair with Donald Trump, AMI could, maybe the defense could argue, no, it wasn't a payoff for hush money to Karen McDougal, but it was actually, we were just buying the rights to a story. So I don't know whether the defense is going to try to keep out that, suppress any information around Karen McDougal. The Access Hollywood tape, I don't think that's going to come in, but maybe the prosecution argues it's relevant to show that this is all part of the hush money scheme, although he again is charged. He's not charged with the Access Hollywood tape here. He's charged with falsifying business records, the checks, the entering into the accounting ledger, claiming it's a payment for legal services or a legal expense, not a disguise for hush money to silence people. Again, that's a factual decision that a jury has to decide. What are the facts here and what do they believe? All right. So anything else? Any other questions? Anyone? Questions? Okay. So jury trial is likely in 2024 if it gets to trial. The motions to dismiss will be hard fought. So I'll hopefully be doing some videos when we get the motions filed by the defense, and we'll see what happens. But this is Donald J. Trump, and anything can happen, and he fights. He fights and he calls people out. And he, he's already said there's no case. He didn't do anything wrong. And all they need to do, all the defense needs to do is convince one or more jurors that Donald Trump is not guilty. Because in order to convict Donald Trump of any one of these charges, all 12 jurors have to vote guilty to convict Donald Trump. If less than 12 vote to convict, it's a hung jury and Donald Trump is not convicted. Okay? So, I hope I answered your questions here. Anything else? Again, thank you for joining me for the live stream tonight. I hope this video is helpful to you. I hope I did a good breakdown on the indictment. And again, it's the same charges over and over again. It involves 11 checks written to Michael Cohen for a sum total of $420,000, but it's actually the $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels, which the prosecution alleges Donald Trump falsified business records, calling it a legal expense for legal services, when actually it was hush money to silence so that Stormy Daniels, all the news around that would not interfere with the presidential election. They were buying her silence so it wouldn't impact Donald Trump's presidential campaign. That's what the prosecution is alleging. Whether or not they can prove it to 12 jurors, reasonable doubt, what was Donald Trump's involvement in the entries into the ledger, into writing these checks? He signed 9 of them. 2 of them he didn't sign. Did he know about this? What's the extent of it? And is that reasonable doubt? Is that enough to show reasonable doubt that he wasn't involved in some of these meetings? So we'll have to see what happens. So again, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you for subscribing. Please do subscribe to my channel to support my work. And if you want to contribute to me making these videos and upgrading my technology here, please, I put a PayPal link if you want to make a donation, or The link is also in the description box below the video. So thank you very much. Oh, last thing. I'm still waiting on the Court of Appeals decision on Sunny Balwani's request to stay at home. Hopefully we hear about it this week or next. But I don't think the Court of Appeal will overturn what the lower court did, what the trial judge did, which was to deny Balwani's request to stay at home during appeal. And again, Elizabeth Holmes has filed the same motion. Judge hasn't decided yet. He's taken it under submission, probably because, and again, in my opinion, he's waiting to see what the Court of Appeal does on the very same decision, very same question, which is whether or not Sunny Balwani can stay at home pending appeal. So we'll see. We'll see. The judge said that he will be making a decision on Elizabeth Holmes' request to stay at home in April. So it's April. So any day now, we should be getting a decision back. And again, my opinion is the judge denies that both of them are not allowed to stay at home pending appeal, and they both surrender to their prisons that they're designated to by the Bureau of Prisons, upcoming here shortly. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. Okay, so again, please do leave a comment. I want to know what your analysis is. Thank you very much for voting in our poll. And again, 60% of you voted that you think Trump's indictment will be dismissed. We'll have to see what happens. Stay tuned, because, you know, every day is quite interesting, and this is a fascinating case, and there's never a dull moment in Trump world. So thanks again for watching. Thanks for joining me for the live, and thanks for subscribing.